begin with, let's look at the farmers, the role of the farmers. This is one of the things I've worked on most in the past 14 years is supply-side strategies, particularly Plan Colombia. And in 2000, or beginning in 1999, the Clinton administration first began sounding the alarm that Colombia was about to become a narco state, that the guerrillas were becoming too powerful, and that we needed $1 billion militarized aid package to fight the drug war in something called Plan Colombia. This was an idea of going after the farmers, going after the coca crops on the ground. And it made for a very simple argument. We know where the stuff is coming from. We know the stuff is growing in Colombia. There are big, vast expanses of coca leaf. Why don't we just go down and destroy this stuff before it can be processed into cocaine and reach our streets and poison our kids? Simple premise. You went through so many congressional hearings and briefings, and it's very tempting when you're looking at these little charts they have on these little easels when they look at South America, and they just point, well, we'll move resources here, here, and here, there, and there, and we'll just clean up this mess. Keep in mind now, Colombia is bigger than Texas and California combined. The same is true of Bolivia, the same is true of Peru. These are very large countries. And there are also lots of regions that are relatively ungoverned, where there's not a lot of state presence. So there aren't authorities to tell you you can't or can do this or that, or plant this particular crop or that crop. And we also have a lot of farmers who live in these remote areas, and it's very difficult to eke out a living there. So from their perspective, what are they going through? For a lot of these farmers, growing illicit crops like coca, and they also grow poppies and marijuana as well, makes good economic sense. From their perspective, these are crops that are relatively easy to process and transport. That's very important. And there are willing buyers. And because of prohibition, they are much more valuable, or relatively more valuable, than growing so-called legal crops, fruits and vegetables, and that sort of thing. And keep in mind that approximately half the planet lives on less than $2, maybe $2.50 a day or so. About 1 billion or more live on less than $1 a day. And in many parts of Latin America, particularly in these rural areas, you're talking about farmers who live on a couple of dollars a day. And that's a reality that most of us can't comprehend. Imagine if this cost $1 in a machine, that 1 billion people on this planet, this is what they have for their entire day. To pay for their food, their housing, their transportation, their education to the extent they get any, or fertilizer, all these things on $1 a day. Or a couple of dollars a day even, that's still quite difficult. And so these farmers live in remote areas where they can grow a couple they do slash and burn agriculture very often in Colombia. Well, they'll go into the Amazon, they'll cut down some rainforest, and they'll leave a lot of the trees standing and leave the trunks there because they don't have mechanized agriculture. They can grow a couple of acres of coca bushes, and you can harvest those leaves and turn them into cocaine, or rather into coca paste. Coca paste is the semi-processed form of cocaine that you can make on a farm using very basic chemicals. Gasoline, cement, sulfuric acid, ammonia, a few other nasty things. That's the best prevention measures I can think of, by the way, is to show people how the stuff is made. You'll think twice before putting it up your nose. But it's nonetheless fairly easy to do. And I spent a day with some coca farmers watching them make the coca paste. And it's in a documentary called Shoveling Water. You could watch it online. Some of you already have, I think, for class. It's on Vimeo. Just Google Shoveling Water and my name and you'll see it. It's about 20 minutes long. And it shows you how easy it is and why they do it. Because you can turn this into a kilo of coca paste, less than a kilo. A couple of acres down to this little bundle. And with that, you can throw it into a backpack. You can walk to the nearest village and sell it. You can do it on horseback or even bicycle or motorcycle if you have a dirt path. Very often there aren't. But instead, we've been demanding that these farmers grow thousands or hundreds of kilos of fruits and vegetables to transport on vehicles they don't have, over roads that quite literally don't exist, to sell in markets, both domestic and export, they can't get access to, and even if they could, to compete against an international global economy. Very often agribusiness imports, subsidized by our tax dollars, and often forced down these countries through free trade agreements, against which these peasant farmers don't stand much of a chance. So it hasn't been working. We've given them a little bit of alternative economic development, but it's been an afterthought, a fig leaf to put on a very bitter militarized pill. So in terms of U.S. assistance to Colombia, about 80% of that has been militarized assistance, trying to, the big stick approach. And less than 20% has gone to judicial reform, witness protection, human rights, alternative economic development, infrastructure, all these other things. So it's been a very lopsided appropriations, and guess what? It hasn't been working very well. In fact, in 2000, when Plan Colombia was first being debated in Congress, the DEA estimated that about 90% of U.S. cocaine originated from Colombia. They have this trace signature program through gas chromatography, mass spectroscopy, where they claim they can identify the exact region where a batch of cocaine came from, where this was produced. Now, the most recent studies from the State Department, the most in the INCSR, the International Narcotics Control and Strategy report, shows that the latest figures show 95.5% of cocaine in the United States originated from Colombia. This is after more than $8 billion of militarized aid. So just to give you a perspective of what these people are going through, this is a satellite photo taken by NASA at night, measures where the major population centers are by light output, so it's skewed toward people who have access to electricity, but nonetheless it gives you a fairly decent a sense of where people are living. But you can see the dark areas here where there's not a whole lot of state presence. Those are much of the coca growing regions. And we have sprayed now more than 4 million acres of Colombia, which is the second most biodiverse country in the world, in the attempt to wipe out the evil bush. Sorry, the other evil bush. Actually, it's not an evil bush because in Bolivia and Peru, indigenous peoples have chewed this leaf for thousands of years. It has lots of good properties. It becomes more problematic when you process it into cocaine. But that's not their problem, even though we're waging a war and declaring that, falsely equivalating, you know what I'm saying. Long day. This is the instrument of our policy, the crop duster. And we spray a very powerful broad spectrum herbicide called Roundup. You can buy a very diluted form of it in your hardware store called Roundup. Well, that's what you buy is Roundup, but we're spraying Roundup Ultra and even more concentrated versions of this. But that bottle you buy in your hardware store comes with a spray applicator and a big warning labels on it, and it tells you to spray the one weed you're trying to kill. We're dumping this stuff by air over vast expanses, and in a futile attempt to try to eradicate this crop. In Colombia especially, geography says a lot. If you look at the infrastructure in Colombia, you'll see that within the 3 fingers of the Andes Mountains are the red lines. Those are the road networks. And if you get to these regions where there's a lot of guerrillas, a lot of coca, a lot of displaced people colonizing the Amazon, that's where the coca is being grown. It's all throughout the country, thanks to Plan Colombia, but this was the epicenter down here. And there's very few roads. Right? Roads are important. They're problematic, but they're important. This is a ground view of what a coca bush looks like, and you can see they leave other trees standing, and they don't need to, it's not mechanized. This is a kid I ran across who is picking coca leaf. This is very early in the morning, and he was doing it to earn money for school books and school uniform. It costs money to go to school, but it's not a lot of money, but it's cost prohibitive for a lot of these people. And so he picks for about 4 hours every morning before it gets really hot. And that gives them enough money to go to school. Incidentally, when I meet with the U.S. Embassy after each of these trips in Colombia, I've had embassy officials lecture me. And these people, these kids, coca's too tempting. They would rather pick coca than go to school. And I said, I wanted to go off on this guy. For the billions you've spent on this stuff, you could have sent every kid in the hemisphere to school, and their children and grandchildren. This is a coca lab where the coca paste is made, and you'll see it in shoveling water. It's a simple shack. You could build it, most of you, with pocket change. And it's the least effective means of stopping cocaine. But if you look at the State Department press releases, they always brag about how many cocaine laboratories they destroyed. This is what they're talking about. The real laboratories that the cartels have are deeply hidden in the jungle. I've never been to one. People who do go very often don't come back. It's not a place you want to stick your nose into. But those are the real laboratories. Unfortunately, they're called kitchens in the local slang, so it's very misleading. This is a still from shoveling water, and this is the output. This guy's showing this is the coca paste. It reeks of gasoline at this stage. It smells like peanut butter and gasoline. It's really weird. This is the close-up of the bowl. The creamy stuff, the brown stuff comes from the earlier phase. The white stuff is more pure from the later stages of extraction. They'll homogenize that, and that's what they'll sell. And if you were a farmer, what would you rather be transporting in this situation? A kilo of paste or hundreds of kilos of fruits and vegetables? This is a major road, by the way. This is in the province of Guaviare, Colombia, which is one of the southern Amazonic provinces. They've been fumigated since 1994. This was the test ground for Plan Colombia and the fumigation campaign. So we've been constantly hammering them. They've received not a dime of USAID alternative development money. So it's been all hammer and no carrot in this particular case. It's also a guerrilla heavily dense with guerrillas, the FARC guerrillas. And so this was, I took this in 2009 during the dry season, by the way. So the other 9 months when it rains, it's just problematic. Anyway, yeah. This is a major road. This is right outside the capital of the province, San Jose del Guaviare. And if you go south into that province, the rest of the province basically, you have to go through this road. And so there are thousands and thousands of families on the other side of that. And if they want to export any of their products to the rest of Colombia or overseas, they have to deal with these kinds of logistics. And if you're a lucky farmer, you might have a farm somewhere near this so-called road. Most of them aren't lucky, and they're several kilometers away. And so we're talking about dirt paths. So imagine hauling all those pineapples or hearts of palm or whatever over perhaps even rivers or creeks. You have to hope that you have enough money to pay the boatman, and he'll take you across. You get to the nearest road. You hope you have enough money, and a truck might come by with some space that will take you to the nearest village. And you got to hope that your neighbors didn't all grow the same thing and show up with pineapples as well, in which case you're just selling pineapples to each other. It's not a really good situation. These are the mercenaries, the private military contractors that fly our spray planes. Very often they're former U.S. military or third country military. And this is what they claim to be doing under Plan Colombia, which is spraying, precision spraying of herbicides. And this is not Kansas, however. We're talking about very hilly terrain, lots of guerrilla gunfire trying to shoot down these planes. Also trees that are left standing, because why not, if they produce bananas or whatever. And so these planes fly much higher than they're supposed to, partly to avoid ground fire. This pilot is pointing at bullet holes that have been patched in his plane by the guerrillas. And it requires helicopter gunships to escort these spray planes as well. This was also a big ticket item under Plan Colombia. And so you can see they're flying at much higher altitude than is recommended. But as a result of this, about 10 seconds after this plane leaves the field of vision here, that stream of spray, I used to think of it as rain, but when you see it firsthand, it actually turns into a giant gas cloud. And it hangs in the air, and the crosswinds will pick it up and move it around, and it destroys lots of other things. This is an overhead shot of a spray plane going over a campesino's house. You can see the rows of young coca seedlings that are being planted there, and the trees are, of course, left there. And that's the shack they live under. This is illegal under Colombian law to spray over a house like that, but it happens all the time. Another similar shot. This is the Black Hawk helicopter, one of the big ticket items under Plan Colombia. And more. This is the view of Putumayo province, one of the ground zero of early U.S. involvement in Plan Colombia. And as you can see, there's more shades of green than Crayola has in their inventory. Right? This is the Amazon and its tributaries we're talking about. And here's a ground eye view of a typical pasture in Putumayo. And this is what happens after we spray it. Basically, it's a broad spectrum herbicide, kills anything green. You can tell it's been sprayed and it's not some kind of ground fungus or whatever, because the treetops are also defoliated. Monsanto, the manufacturer of the herbicide, says don't let your children or livestock play or graze on these lands and that sort of thing until it's thoroughly dry. These are peasant farmers. They don't have money for fancy corrals, much less alternative feeds. It's hard to prove causality, that this was caused by our spraying. Similarly with human health effects, lots of skin rashes, vomiting, diarrhea, that sort of thing. When I brought this up with the U.S. Embassy, they said, oh, no, these people live in a jungle. You can't prove that we caused this. Maybe it's a fungus, these rashes. It's bug bites or something. You can't prove. And it's true. It's very difficult for us to prove this. We didn't watch people get sprayed. We didn't measure the dosage and watch them get sick over time. We don't experiment on living human beings, and you can't get a lot of doctors down there to cooperate with this kind of a study. And we spray over all kinds of food crops as well as alternative development projects. This is an aquaculture project, the fish ponds where they teach farmers to grow tilapia and other fish for some local protein. We spray over that as well, and then, of course, the fish are very sensitive and it kills them. This is an agricultural school where we teach farmers to grow other crops besides coca. funded by international development agencies. Guess what? We sprayed that as well. You get the idea. It's kind of imprecise. If you're flying, almost 100 miles an hour at treetop level, looking down, green on green, you have a fraction of a second to decide when to pull that trigger to release your spray. And if you hesitate, you've sprayed something else entirely. They claim, however, this is GPS-guided precision spraying, but I would beg to differ. These are bananas. This is papayas. Corn is very easily affected. It dries up and shrivels up. This is an orange tree. There are a couple of oranges left, but they've been essentially defoliated. This is a huge expanse that had no coca on it, and everything around it was green except for this patch. The pilot just let go on his tanks and sprayed. Ironically, anecdotally at least, a lot of locals say that this kind of thing happens around 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, around quitting time, happy hour. Maybe they're in a hurry to get back to the base and they can't go back with a full tank or with chemicals. And so sometimes that happens, allegedly. This is a children's mural from the region. It shows you from their perspective how they see things. This is before, during, and after. Pretty much says it all from their perspective. And finally, this is these are children holding up in Putumayo food crops that have been destroyed by our spray planes. When I took this in 2002, it didn't occur to me that I would still be working on this subject so many years later. And had I known, it would have changed my advocacy strategy and everything else. But the thing that haunts me to this day is, where are these kids today? 11 years later, these kids are of fighting age. They would have had to have picked sides to decide what to do. If they go deeper into the Amazon, cut down more rainforest, plant more coca, that's bad. If they join the guerrillas, that's bad. If they join the paramilitary death squads, who are the rivals of the guerrillas, that's bad. If they join the narcos, that's bad. If they become displaced and join the already 5 million or so internally displaced people in Colombia after 5 decades of civil war, that's a catastrophe, a humanitarian catastrophe. And so any of these policy outcomes is a disaster from both the perspective of U.S. policy and Colombian policy. But the drug warriors, they operate under different metrics of what constitutes progress or success. So instead of bringing people into the arms of the state to show that, hey, the government offers you something better, we'd rather you didn't grow these kinds of crops, we're going to help you do something else, instead of helping them, we've been punishing them. So they've begun to associate the state with death, destruction, and suffering, which is not a good way to win hearts and minds, and not what you want to do in the midst of a 5-decade-old civil war, the oldest, longest-running civil war in this hemisphere. It's far more complicated. Barely scratched the surface, but it gives you a sense of where they're coming from. Meanwhile, particularly during the Bush years, whenever you heard debates in Congress, you didn't hear about peasant farmers. You didn't hear about any of these issues. Basically, it was narco-terrorists. We were only going after narco-terrorists. These are not terrorists. These are family farmers, much like anywhere else in the world. By some accident of birth, by some accident of latitude and longitude, they were born in one set of coordinates. You were born in another one. They are given a very different, dealt a different hand of cards to play. Now, from the trafficker's perspective, why are they doing this? Duh, it's where the money is. Why is there money there? Why is this stuff valuable? This is really the catch-22 of the war on drugs. Because what we're talking about, when you think about all the violence in Mexico, in the past 5 years, anywhere from 60 to 100, more than 100,000 dead, they've lost count. They stopped counting, basically. When all this fighting and bloodshed in Colombia and other places, in Guatemala and Honduras, what people are fighting for are essentially minimally processed agricultural commodities that cost pennies per dose to produce under a legal market. So there's no reason that heroin, cocaine, marijuana should be worth the money that they are. These are essentially weeds and shrubs that are easy to grow. There's nothing exotic about them. But it's our policies of prohibition that make them so very, very valuable. The drug war is, in my opinion, a form of price support for drug traffickers. Unintended, perhaps, but it's effectively what it is. It's a crop subsidy, if you will. We destroy just enough crop to keep while the demand remains high, helping keep prices propped up. But as the drug moves across borders, it begins to pick up more and more value. And you can buy, let's say, a kilo of pure cocaine in the streets of Medellin for about maybe $1,500, give or take. It'll fluctuate from time to time a little bit. But by the time you got it to the streets of the United States, in Washington or Baltimore or Philadelphia or wherever, and by the time the dealers take that kilo and cut it up into little gram bags and dilute it with whatever garbage they cut it with to stretch their profits, you can get approximately $100,000 to $150,000 for that exact same kilogram. Okay, so what users are paying for on the streets are essentially transportation costs, or more accurately, the risks associated with transportation. If you sent that same kilo by FedEx or DHL, maybe it'll cost you $100, $200 at most. But because we have this incredible gauntlet they have to run through, and because of the risks involved, they're able to charge increasing sums of money. And so our politicians keep escalating the war on drugs, thinking, oh, that'll show them, that'll stop things. But as the higher the risk to the trafficker, the higher the risk premium they can charge the next person down the smuggling chain. That if the longer potential prison sentence they may have to serve, the higher the likelihood they'll get caught, the likelihood they might get killed by law enforcement or by their own rivals, the greater the risk, the greater the reward for them. And it goes something like, hey, things are really hairy for me right now. The Coast Guard's got onto me. The police have my photo. It's getting, and I'm going to have to charge you more this time. So I'm going to charge you 20% more. And if you can find someone else willing to sell it to you for less, you go ahead and buy it from them. But this is what I'm charging. And generally, they'll pay it the next person down the line. Because by the time you get to the street price, all of this price as it accumulates is actually a fraction of the total street value. And so these drug traffickers then they're among the people who want this drug war to end the least. Because drug warriors and drug traffickers, in a more cynical interpretation, I would say they have a symbiotic relationship, that neither one can make a comfortable living without the other. Without the war on drugs, the drug traffickers would not be interested because these are minimally processed agricultural commodities. And without war on drugs, you have lots of people in law enforcement, in the bureaucracies, and in prisons who would lose their jobs. So they fight tooth and nail to preserve that, as we would all if our jobs were on the line, if our funding was on the line, if it was threatened. They're no different. So throughout this filtering effect, decade after decade, we've been selectively breeding, if you will, super traffickers. Right? We will never make these substances disappear by making them astronomically more valuable, which is the other effect that we do with prohibition. And so it's kind of like how public health professionals say you shouldn't take antibiotics every time you have a sore throat. It might be viral rather than bacterial. You shouldn't overuse hand sanitizers and antibacterial detergents and soaps because it kills off the weak strains of these bugs, and the drug-resistant ones, therefore, take over that space and multiply. Somewhat analogous to what we've been doing with the drug war. Now, the evolution of the drug trafficking, also the cat and mouse game, is very disturbing. It's comical in some ways, but it's actually quite disturbing. We've essentially set up an X prize for drug traffickers. If you can figure out how to penetrate our borders or any other borders, you stand to make a tremendous amount of money. So it's not the government offering or some billionaire offering the X prize, but it's the black market. And so by air, sea, and land, they've evolved. In the old days, they would use fishing boats and maybe smuggle drugs in the hold with ice and fish, and you'll see some drugs in there. We began intercepting those boats, inspecting them. They switched to go-fast boats or speed boats, very often where they were outrunning law enforcement, and then we beefed up the Coast Guard and law enforcement's boats and added helicopters. So they switched to semi-submersible submarines. They say about 90% underwater. There's a small conning tower, built of fiberglass. They built them in the estuaries, and they just launched them. And you can move 8 to 10 tons at a time of cocaine and anything else. And during the daytime, they'll very often throw a blue tarp over the conning tower, and it blends into the ocean. As one DEA agent said, you try finding something the size of a log floating in the Pacific Ocean. Good luck to you. But nonetheless, we've done that. We've been figuring out how to detect some of these semi-submersibles. And so now they've gone to fully submersible submarines. They're actually building proper subs that can dive maybe 50 feet. They don't need to go really deep. They don't need to launch missiles. But so they're able to experiment with even better materials, composites and carbon fiber and whatnot. And those are very, very difficult to detect. On air, by air, in the old days it would be small planes. They then experimented with old cargo planes or jetliners. They've used DC-3s, 727s, disposable. They crash them on the other end because there's still enough money from the product they move to pay for that. Now we've started shooting those things down, intercepting them. They've switched to ultralights now that can go over our border wall, but under the radar, and they have drop cages underneath them. The pilot just releases that, and a couple of 100 pounds of drugs falls down. Their accomplices pick it up on the other side. Eventually, I think they'll move to unmanned aerial vehicles and maritime vehicles as well. There's no pilot or captain to capture, and no one to inform anyone. It's also much cheaper. By land, they've also evolved. So it used to be the Mexican border. They come by cars. We inspect the cars. NAFTA, free trade agreement happens. Moves much more produce and commerce across those borders much faster. So we built these X-ray scanners that can scan flatbed trucks, and they adapted very easily to that through bribery, through narco tunnels. The border regions are riddled with narco tunnels now. We've discovered more than 100 of them. They're getting incredibly sophisticated. The one that was discovered in Tijuana last summer was very long. It had concrete floors, air conditioning, ventilation, rail system. This is very sophisticated stuff. And on the other side, the Mexican side, they found 40 tons of cannabis being ready to move across that tunnel. Now, those tunnels also work both ways. They can repatriate cash. And I suspect they can also move guns and ammunition across those things as well. They also, last month, 2 months ago, found captured a flatbed pickup truck, rather, with a pneumatic cannon mounted on it, kind of like a giant T-shirt cannon, compressed air, and they would shoot bundles of drugs over the wall. But they didn't even need to do that. They've been using ancient technology, Roman technology, very well for many years now. Catapults. Right? They just lob it over the wall. And the wall itself, many parts of the wall have 4-inch gaps in them because it's perfect to stop humans, and you let wildlife and other things pass through. And the traffickers realized, oh, our packages, let's make them 3 3/4 inches and pass them right through the wall. You get the sense of why this is kind of disturbing, right? Because not only is there drug trafficking, right now there's no incentive for the cartels to do this, but maybe some lieutenant might be bribed to help, say, a terrorist, to someone who really wants to do some damage rather than just make money, to move WMDs or whatever through these ways of infiltrating our borders. So it's not good to have an X Prize to tempt people, to get them to figure out ways to penetrate our borders. And by themselves, the terrorists would not be able to do this. It's simply too laborious, and it takes a lot of infrastructure and financial incentive to come up with these things. Drug warriors, what's their incentive? What's their perspective on this? I've met a lot of honorable people who do this kind of thing, and they rationalize a lot of this very often. Maybe stopping, the 100 kilos we stopped the other day isn't going to do much, but that's 100 kilos kids won't be using in the United States. On the other hand, you've created a price support for the rest of the drugs, and all these other things we talked about. Right? These are not necessarily bad people. I've met some real jerks, but there are lots of good people doing this kind of thing. I just happen to disagree with what they're doing. So I don't want to make it an ad hominem thing. Very few people, by the way, think of themselves as evil people. And I used to read diaries of war criminals in World War II, and even they, who did the horrible things, found ways to rationalize what they were doing. And so you need to do that, just to be able to face yourself in the mirror every day, to get out of bed. Very few people wake up in the morning and think, Smithers, I feel really evil this morning. Find me a dog to kick. It doesn't work that way. But, and there are others, however, who realize this will never work. They're very cynical. They still, because it's a job. It's an easy salary, relatively secure salary. And so they find ways, again, not to rock the boat. I'm only following orders, etc. And you can show how a lot of what they do is actually counterproductive. The kingpin strategy that we've been using in Mexico, for instance, to fracture the cartels and to capture the kingpins, great for politicians, really disastrous for Mexico. Capturing kingpins has been one of the most counterproductive things we've done. Not that these are good people. I hope terrible things happen to them someday. But right now, if you have this tantrum of going after the kingpins, it's great for politicians. They get to parade these people in front of cameras and stuff. But what you do when you take out a kingpin is you end up opening up a vacuum. And that vacuum is going to be filled either by rival cartels or by their own lieutenants. And they may fight and form factions to take over that cartel, which then increases violence even more. And again, it's analogous at a micro level to our own situation in a lot of our inner cities, for instance. I used to work in Baltimore looking in the early days. And parents would say to me, why can't we just round up these dealers? They're right on the street corner. I know where they are. They're on that street corner. Why won't the police come and take them off that street corner? And we did that a lot in the 80s, and that's one of the reasons why the crack epidemic was so violent, because crack was a relatively new drug. The turf lines hadn't been established as to who gets to deal where, and you had a lot of shootouts. And so a lot of the more experienced police departments know not to upset that equilibrium unless you have a really good plan B. Because what you do when you take a street corner dealer off that corner is you open up a valuable piece of real estate. You create a job opportunity. And open-air drug markets, again, a function of policy, by the way. In the old days, before mandatory minimums, before crack, before the 80s, a dealer would service, carry enough drugs for the weekend and a backpack or something, would service the clients, go to their homes, make the transactions behind closed doors. It was one-on-one. But after mandatory minimums and stuff, no one wanted to be caught with lots of drugs because it would trigger a mandatory sentence. So then you had to bring more people into the operation. You create crews, and someone will hold, be the lookout, someone will hold some of the drugs, someone will hold some of the money, small quantities. You bring in children because their records will be expunged when they become adults. And so you needed a whole operation now to do this. And the reason open-air drug markets are so valuable is because that's where people know to go to buy drugs. Right? And people from the suburbs, by the way. In Baltimore, I could watch the cars come in and see that these are white folks from the suburbs coming in to buy the drugs. Now, when you take that dealer off the corner, you create rivalries. So competing gangs, crews will come to fight over that space. They can't settle the disputes legally. They can't go to a judge and say, Your Honor, I've been dealing drugs in the city for 15 years and this upstart gang took over my corner. Please take them, send them away. They can't do that. So they settle their disagreements by violence or threats of extreme violence. On a macro level, that's kind of what's been happening in Mexico. So that so when you have all these drug trafficking cartels, and President Calderon used a very foolish and visceral response when he first came into power 5 years ago. He brought in 50,000 troops and decided to hammer them. He couldn't use the police, state police or local police, because they were too corrupt. So he brought in the military, who were also corrupt. But nonetheless, by whacking each of these cartels, you weaken one, the others think it's their turn to take over that turf because they've been weakened, and you whack another one, et cetera, and it keeps moving the steamroller back and forth. And pretty soon you see how you can rack up 100,000 dead very quickly. And so at the end of the day, there will still be drug traffickers. At the end of this turf wars ought to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. What Calderon's policies did was ensure that the middle would be stretched indefinitely. They would never find the equilibrium that they were looking for. And so at the end of this process, there will still be cartels trafficking and supplying U.S. demand. They'll slightly different constellations, slightly different turf lines, but they'll still be there. No drug warrior I've talked to, no one in their wildest dreams believes they'll be eliminated after this. And so I have to ask, to what end? To what end have we done this? To kill this many lives? What could we point to show for it? President Calderon realized this as well. This was a tough drug warrior. He was a #1 drug war ally. And yet in last September, at the UN General Assembly opening, each head of state is invited to give a 20-minute remark to the global body, General Assembly. President Calderon gave a 40-minute speech. First 20 minutes were blah, 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 platitudes. And the second half of that speech was explosive. And I think he was looking towards his legacy, wanting to get on the right side of history, as so many politicians do on gay marriage, for instance. But he launched into a 20-minute attack on prohibition and the drug war that I had a hard time disagreeing with anything he said. It was that good. And that's shocking. And the UN actually censored it and edited his summaries to reverse the meaning of what he said, which is shocking in itself. But nonetheless, he said that unless you people in the U.S. can eliminate or significantly reduce your demand, which isn't going to happen anytime soon, then we have kit-based solutions, which is diplomatic code for regulation, decriminalization, legalization, alternatives basically to prohibition. From the user's perspective, perhaps many of us are more familiar with that. We see this in our own communities and such. And it's very complex why people choose to self-medicate or use drugs. There's use, abuse, and addiction, by the way. There are three different things. Not all use is abuse, not all abuse is addiction. And I'm more concerned with problematic use and addiction, not recreational or experimentation. And so what the drug czar's office says, fewer people are using drugs. What they're talking about are experimentation very often. The hardcore users, we don't have much luck in terms of changing those demographics. And these things go up and down. It's fashion. Certain drugs are popular in one decade, less so in the next, et cetera. And they go up and down all the time. But from a user's perspective, I think and I've traveled throughout the world, all over the country, and the common denominator I find, both on the consumption side and the production side of drugs, I find that the root causes of these things are rooted in what I call the PDA problem. I don't mean personal digital assistant or public displays of affection. I mean poverty, despair, and alienation. Those are at the roots of why peasant farmers who hysterically are abandoned by the state resort to a lot of these things, why some people form insurgencies, terrorism even, and why people choose to self-medicate in the United States. Poverty is an easy one to look at. You can see it, you can identify it, and point to it. And that's easy, but that's not the only reason. In fact, lots of wealthy people, affluent people also use drugs. And that's why I want, despair and alienation cut across class lines in very interesting ways. Let me just read a quote here from you from Bobby Kennedy, RFK, in 1965. This was, it still moves me to this day. Before we declared the war on drugs, he tried to look at the narcotics problem. And he went to Harlem and he looked at a lot of depressed communities, and he actually, he was a border crosser. He actually broke bread with people, tried to understand their motivations and their reality. And so he told Congress in '65, "Now, more than at any other time in our history, the addict is a product of a society which has moved faster and further than has allowed him to go. A society which in its complexity and its increasing material comfort has left him behind. In taking up the use of drugs, the addict is merely exhibiting the outermost aspects of a deep-seated alienation from the society, of a combination of personal problems having both psychological and sociological aspects. The fact that addiction is bound up with the hard core of the worst problems confronting us socially makes it discouraging at the outset to talk about solving it. Because solving it really means solving poverty and broken homes, racial discrimination and inadequate education, slums and unemployment." Generations later, we haven't learned squat from what Bobby Kennedy tried to warn us about. In fact, we've gone the other direction. We tried to be tough. That's caused an explosion of our prison population. We now have the biggest prison population on the planet, about 2.3 million people behind bars. There are only about 9 million plus prisoners on planet Earth. So the U.S., with less than 5% of the planet's population, has more than a quarter of the planet's prisoners. We incarcerate more people in absolute numbers and per capita than any other country. And this is largely a result of the drug war, especially post-1980s when the mandatory minimums kick in. Put another way, that those 2.3 million people behind bars, about 500,000 of them are there for nonviolent drug offenses, a little less nowadays. But that roughly 500,000 figure is more than the EU incarcerates for all offenses combined, including drugs and assault and murder and everything else. So either Americans are, 7 sometimes more evil than people in Europe, or there's something seriously screwed up with our criminal justice system. That almost 500,000 drug war prisoners is more people than we had in our entire prison system in 1980. And if you're old enough, ask yourself, are you any safer today than you were in 1980? And so that's from the user's perspective. Again, it's quite complicated. When I worked in Baltimore, some of these communities were so devastated. There were no jobs, no access to job training programs, no transportation to the jobs that might exist in the suburbs, because the infrastructure is designed to move people from the suburbs into the inner city, not the other way around. And the These are people for whom tomorrow was not going to be a better day. They believe that their best days are behind them, and it was difficult for me to convince them otherwise. And our response to these people as a society has essentially been to say, you need to be sober and have no job and no hope and no future and no opportunity. That is not sustainable. So when I was born, Lyndon Johnson began his War on Poverty, the Great Society programs. But they never really got off the ground because it was a guns or butter decision he had to make. The war on poverty had to compete with the war in Vietnam, and guns won out over butter. And so generations have been born into conditions of poverty, despair, and alienation. And now chickens have come home to roost in many ways, and now we're at that juncture again. Are we going to finally invest in our communities and schools and give people hope and opportunity, a reason to look forward to tomorrow, which I think is the best prevention strategy I can think of, is you give someone a reason to look forward to tomorrow. Not their next fix, but a real reason. And, or are we going to do the usual and hire more police, more prosecutors, build more prisons to deal with drug abuse and addiction, which is about as effective as digging more graves to solve the international AIDS crisis? It really solves nothing, right? And so it's a guns or butter decision again. And this comes back to our politicians. Why did they do this? Why, after all this evidence, are they still stubbornly in support of the war on drugs? Craig Reinerman, a sociologist from UC Santa Cruz, I think has one of the most eloquent quotes about this. And he looks at it from a structural point of view. He said, drugs are richly functional scapegoats. They provide the elites with fig leaves to place over the unsightly social ills that are endemic to the social system over which they preside. They provide the public with a restricted aperture of attribution in which only the chemical boogeyman or lone deviant come into view. And the social causes of a cornucopia of complex problems are out of the picture. Drugs are a very useful scapegoat in that sense. For politicians, a lot of them get that, but they, and privately, I've had lots of private conversations with politicians. Maybe visited and did advocacy, education, with more than 300, maybe 400 congressional offices over the years. And when I sit down with these staffers and chiefs of staff, legislative directors, sometimes the member of Congress themselves, when the doors are closed, it's a very different discourse very often. I've had both conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans, when the doors are closed, ask me, so what do you think about regulation, taxation, decriminalization, legalization? What about those options? As though they were the only ones who had ever thought of that question. It's a very paranoid environment on Capitol Hill. Even within a congressional office, very often there's a lot of backbiting and treachery going on. And very often they don't want to seem like they're unsophisticated. And the reason they're doing this, the reason they're so closeted about this, is that drug policy, the solutions to drug problems are very often counterintuitive. That is to say that the obvious solutions, the knee-jerk solutions, are very often the wrong ones. And it's difficult to message a counterintuitive solution. It takes more time, it's more complex, and the advantage goes to the side using the knee-jerk, easy solution. One of my favorite popular philosophers, last name Simpson, first name Bartholomew, you've probably heard of him. Bart Simpson runs for class president in an episode of The Simpsons, and I think he put it really well. You can learn all of life's lessons in some way or another in some episode of The Simpsons, but another, he begins by attacking his opponent. And he says, my opponent says there are no easy answers. Well, I say she's not looking hard enough. That's the problem with Congress. That's the problem with Washington. That's why Fox News is so effective. The easy solutions are the ones that appeal to people, and they're very intuitive. We're broke. You want to spend more money? What are you, insane? But it takes much more time to explain Keynesian economics, the multiplier effect, et cetera. Democrats used to be able to do that, by the way. It used to be in their DNA. They've had it beaten out of them by neoliberalism and whatnot. But anyway, the ratio of expenditure in terms of campaign ads of attacker versus defender becomes so cost prohibitive that it's difficult for politicians to take on any kind of third rail political issue. Third rail, do people know what third rail means? It's a DC term. It refers to the subway system. 2 rails carry the train. The third rail is high voltage. If you touch it, you're dead. So historically, there are all kinds of third rail political issues that politicians run away from because no matter which position you take, you're guaranteed to anger a significant part of the electorate. And so those issues are like gun control, raising taxes, U.S. policy on Israel, drugs and crime, Social Security, Obamacare, even climate change is controversial. Gay marriage used to be a third rail issue, but the polarity of that is switching very quickly. A lot of that has to do with demographic shifts. And if you've heard my other talks in the Conference on World Affairs, you heard me elaborate on why things are changing so rapidly. And I think it bodes well for drug policy reform. But if you liken, I liken this to Twitter. If you're looking at campaign ads, for instance, campaign ads are relatively cheap to produce, given the effect they have on your opponent's ratings and popularity. And so you can launch smear ads very easily. And we've just been through a vicious election, one of the most vicious election cycles, and you've seen them, no doubt, in Colorado and other places. But imagine an ad that goes something like this. Carol Conzelman represents Boulder and Congress, and she's a liberal, and I'm a tea bagger, a tea partier, and I want to unseat her. And I'm going to run an ad that goes something like this. Friends, Congresswoman Conzelman doesn't care if your kids are addicted to drugs. She knows where the drugs are coming from. The governments of Mexico and Colombia asked her, they begged her to help fight this war on drugs. She refused to supply that aid. Come on, folks. We know where the drugs are coming from. Send me to Washington. I'll approve this aid. We'll go down there and clean up this mess, and I'll protect your kids. Now, Carol, if she's lucky, either has a big war chest and can run lots of ads, very complicated ads, explaining her position, or she can hope that all the people who saw my smear ad run over and over and over again are going to tune into the 6 o'clock or 11 o'clock local news to see her 1 minute or 2 minute soundbite as to why this is a bad idea. It's not impossible to do, but it's difficult to do. And I don't want people to think that drugs alone, being soft on drugs, is enough to cost a member of Congress or elected official their seats. But you can turn the tables. And in fact, if you can communicate a paradigm shift in a soundbite, you can get political traction in Washington. But if you have to write a 50-page paper or a 500-page dissertation on a controversial subject, you're not going to get any movement. Because those politicians have to hope that when you're in the voting booth, that you remember their solutions, their reasons for these policies, rather than the knee-jerk ones, that you're soft on drugs, you don't care about drugs, or whatever. And so you could, Congresswoman Conzelman wanted to defend herself, she could in a soundbite. You could say that, sending guns and helicopters to Latin America isn't going to solve the problem of poverty in the Andes or the Amazon, and it's certainly not going to solve the problem of addiction in the United States. And you've heard me, we could build more prisons, prosecutors, police, etc., or so on and so forth. So you can do that in an economical way. But keep in mind that congressional staffers, particularly in the House side, are typically 25, 26 years old. That's being generous, and they're overworked. Their portfolios are, the way they hand out portfolios, who covers what subject, is so arbitrary, and it varies from office to office. But if you had a course in education, okay, you got the education portfolio. You came from a farm, okay, you got the farm agriculture portfolio. And so people I talk to who work on drug policy or Colombia or whatever, they have all these other things they have to be on top of. And they have to tell their boss at any given time, and these vote bells are going off all the time in Congress. On some obscure amendments to this or that. How do we vote on this and that? What's the party's position? What's our constituents saying? And so they have about this much time over the course of the year to think about the issues that I'm talking about right now. And so they're not going to be the ones that come up with these sound bites and the talking points for their bosses. And if they don't do it, their bosses aren't going to do it. Who's going to do it? Sometimes I do that, but I'm one person. Anyway, that gives you a sense of some of the politics behind this. And it's changing, though. It's changing just as gay marriage is changing. Politicians are essentially herd animals. And when the herd starts to move, it doesn't pay to be a straggler. You get eaten by lions. And so on gay marriage, the Democrats especially are falling over each other to evolve their positions. And demographically, it's very important to keep in mind that what cost Romney, one of the things that cost him this election, is that the Obama campaign understood this demographic shift and had their finger on it like nobody's business. And whereas the Romney campaign just assumed that the eternal verities on these cultural war issues would remain. But how can I put it this way? The generation that came of age in the 60s, a lot of our cultural war issues can be traced back to where one stood on the Vietnam War. If you're anti-war, then it probably is a good indicator of your positions on racial integration, on women's liberation, sexuality, sex, drugs, rock and roll, all these things. And that divided the country very bitterly. And those ripples from those cultural war schisms echoed for decades afterwards. Keep in mind, in 2004, John Kerry didn't lose because of his position on the Iraq War. He got screwed over the Vietnam War, swift boating. These things play out over a long period. Flag burning amendments that the Republicans used to love to put on ballots in election years, right? Or anti-gay marriage amendments that in 2004 were very useful to the GOP then, and they're counterproductive now. They've screwed them. They've painted themselves into a demographic corner because the generation of the 60s, John McCain and people, no offense, but they're receding into the rearview mirror of our political discourse in this country, and a whole new generation now is moving forward. And they don't have a dog in that fight on gay marriage, on all these traditional cultural war issues. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't going to be new cultural war issues. I think people are always looking, if you're a political operative, you're always looking for opportunities to find new wedge issues to polarize and separate people and to get them to vote against, very often against their own economic interests on social issues and that sort of thing. So that's the basically thumbnail sketch of the various actors involved. Where do things stand today? I think that I've seen more change in the past 2 years than I have in 14 years in drug policy. I think because of what happened in Colorado and Washington State in this last election, the world is looking at you all, and this has ripple effects throughout the hemisphere and around the world, in fact. There have been many governments in Latin America that would love to tell the U.S. to take a hike with our drug war policies. And for the longest time, it looked like U.S. drug policy had universal support within the country. If you look at the voting records in Congress, if you look at our State Department and our diplomatic delegations, they all march in lockstep. It looks like this drug war is a monolithic institution in the United States. And yet that monolith consensus is a mile wide and an inch thick. It's a false consensus. And that is, in some way, a way to solve some of these problems. The Prime Minister of Luxembourg was talking about a different third rail issue at home, about trade and stuff, but he said, he had a very useful quote. He said, look, we all know what needs to be done. We just don't know how to get reelected after we've done it. And the solution, I think, comes from Oscar Wilde, who said, if you want a man to tell you the truth, give him a mask. Can we give our politicians a mask? Because everyone else gets it. The media get it. Ex-law enforcement get it. Ex-politicians get it. The general public gets it. The drug war has been a dismal failure. But our politicians are the last ones to react on this. Why is that? Well, if you had an anonymous straw poll, for instance, in Congress, would you have different results? If you gave them political cover, a veil of anonymity, that for 15 minutes in a procedural exercise, non-binding, I don't believe in making laws in secret, but if you had a non-binding straw poll, secret straw poll, for 15 minutes, no one would know how you voted. Not your spouse, not your children, not your party leadership, not your lobbyists, your political campaign donors, not your constituents, nobody. You and your conscience. And as long as one person votes on the other side of the issue, no one can prove it wasn't you that deviated from the party line. And if you allowed those numbers to be published at the end, that after this survey, that it turns out that 3/4 of Congress believes that, or 2/3 believe that it's time to tax and regulate cannabis, or it's time to allow gay marriage, or whatever. That aggregate number gives political cover for politicians when it comes time for the recorded votes. You can bring a politician to water, but you can't make them drink, rather. At the end of the day, they still have to vote. But it gives them some political cover to say, look, I'm actually being courageous. I'm saying in public what most of my colleagues believe in private. It's time we had an adult conversation. And yes, these problems are counterintuitive. And this is my calling card on Capitol Hill. This is what I give to staffers and members to explain what a counterintuitive problem looks like. Right? Mexican finger traps, Chinese finger traps, the harder you pull, the stucker you get. That's very much analogous to prohibition or to counterinsurgency in Iraq or a lot of other things, that the knee-jerk solution of pulling actually screws you even more. And it's counterintuitive to think that you need to relax or even push in a little bit, and that's how you extricate yourself. But if you whip one of these out, if you're stuck in front of a TV camera, you're a member of Congress, your voters can relate to this toy more than they can relate to some abstract arguments. There's also now global rebellion against the drug war. There's a great documentary that's coming out called Breaking the Taboo. Richard Branson's son, Sam Branson, made. It's already premiered in the UK. Incredible. They showed it in Parliament. It has Kofi Annan, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, lots of ex-presidents from various countries all over the world coming out against the drug war, including Bill Clinton. This is very important. Bill Clinton not only comes out against the drug war, he comes out against Plan Colombia, which he has always defended. This was his baby. And for him to come out and say this was a dismal failure, when Hillary still has political skin in the game, is big. That's big news. So when it hits the U.S., be sure to catch that. I think you can catch clips of it on YouTube as well. Anyway, lots is happening. Things are looking good, but it's hard to predict when the tipping points will happen. But if I were an historian writing a book about the end of empires 100 years ago, people would have said, you're crazy. Empires are the way of the world. They're always going to be with us. Within a generation, they were gone, at least formally. If I were writing about women's suffrage movement, same period, same argument. Generation later, less than a generation, boom, there it was. If I were writing about civil rights in the 1940s or 50s, people said that'll never happen. Within a decade or two, we had Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, et cetera, et cetera. Even the fall of the Berlin Wall caught the CIA by surprise, right? So the only thing I can promise you as an historian is that the only thing that's inevitable is change, and sometimes it's even for the better. So thank you very much. I'll try to answer this question.